Camp Florence, Arizona, summer 1944. The air was already hot before sunrise, dust in the throat, disinfectant in the nose. Everything smelled like metal and bleach, rows of cots, German prisoners of war lying under thin army blankets, their bodies too big for the cheap frames, and in the middle of them, a black nurse in a starched white cap, Second Lieutenant Elinor Powell, 24 years old, Army Nurse Corps, United States of America. Her gloves were on. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were calm in a way that made the room quieter. She pressed 2 fingers to the neck of a feverish German soldier, counted his pulse, adjusted his IV. He watched her, not with hate, with something closer to disbelief. At the doorway, an American medic leaned back and whispered to another, "Look at that. She's touching them." She heard it. Of course she heard it. She didn't respond. She just kept working. The prisoner tried to speak to her in a soft, formal German. "Schwester, danke." "Nurse, thank you." She nodded once. Outside the ward, desert light burned white through canvas. Inside, you could hear only the slow rattle of a fan and a cough at the far end of the tent. This was a U.S. Army POW hospital. This was enemy territory, technically, and she was the one keeping the enemy alive. No one in that room said the quiet part out loud. She was allowed to save a captured Nazi, but not allowed to lay a hand on a wounded white American. Not in 1944. Not in this country. Not with her skin. This story isn't about the German on that cot, not his uniform, not his flag. It's not even about World War II in Europe. It's about the United States. It's about a black American nurse sworn to army duty, ordered to care for Nazi prisoners of war. Because the army would not let her treat its own white soldiers, she could lower the fever of a man who once saluted Hitler. But she wasn't cleared to touch an American. That wasn't a mistake. That was policy. And one night in that desert ward, she understood exactly what that meant. This isn't a story about mercy and war. It's a story about what America was willing to admit and what it refused to admit in front of its own black women. Before she ever laid a hand on a German prisoner, Elinor Powell thought she knew what serving her country would look like. She had grown up in a country at war. She had watched recruiting posters. Serve, help, heal. She believed that joining the Army Nurse Corps meant standing beside American soldiers, stopping them from bleeding out, keeping them alive long enough to go home. That was the promise. Reality was different. In 1944, the United States military was still segregated by race, not just socially, structurally. In writing, separate barracks, separate dining, separate expectation, even in medical care. White nurses were assigned to white wards. White surgeons operated on white troops. White officers ran white hospitals. Black nurses, when they were allowed in at all, were pushed to the edges of the system. This wasn't an accident. This was by design. The Army Nurse Corps accepted tens of thousands of white nurses during the war. It accepted only a few hundred black nurses. Elinor Powell was one of them. That alone was a fight. To wear the U.S. uniform, she had to get through people who told her, straight to her face, that she was not needed, that the quotas are full, that colored nurses are not a priority. When she finally made it in, she imagined she'd be sent to a combat hospital, maybe even to Europe, maybe to a stateside ward full of young Americans with shrapnel, shock, infection. That is not where they sent her. They put her on a train to Arizona, not to treat U.S. soldiers, to treat Germans. Camp Florence did not look like a hero's hospital. It was a POW camp in the middle of the Sonoran Desert, about an hour southeast of Phoenix. Heat that stuck to the skin, dust that lived in your teeth, low-slung tents, wooden barracks, barbed wire, guard towers, and inside row after row of German prisoners of war. Not all of them were loyal Nazis. Some were drafted infantry. Some were airmen shot down over North Africa. Some were kids who didn't even shave yet. But to America, officially, they were enemy combatants. To her, they were patients. The logic the Army used sounded clean on paper. There were German POWs on U.S. soil. They had to be housed, fed, treated under Geneva Convention standards. Medical staff was needed. White nurses didn't want to do it, so the Army decided, send black nurses, keep them away from white American soldiers, put them on the prisoners instead. That solved 2 problems at once. It satisfied international law, and it kept the color line intact. In other words, you can serve, but you will serve where we tell you, and we will make sure you know why. When Elinor arrived at Camp Florence, she understood immediately that she had been placed in a structure, not a hospital. Everything had an order to it. White American doctors gave instructions. White American MPs enforced discipline. German POWs, even sick ones, were logged, tagged, and processed with military efficiency. And then there were the black nurses. They were present, they were essential, and they were invisible. They cleaned wounds, took temperatures, watched for infection, carried bedpans through the heat, sat next to men through fever spikes at 2 a.m. They did the work that kept these prisoners alive, but they were not allowed to cross an invisible line, the line between enemy we're obligated to treat and our boys. Elinor learned the rule on her first day, and it did not come in the form of a memo. It came as a correction. She reached for a chart. An American orderly, white, junior rank, stopped her wrist and said almost casually, "Those are for U.S. patients. Don't worry about those. You'll stay in the German ward. You'll stay in the German ward, not, we need you here because you're qualified, not you're best with infection cases. Just, you don't touch them. Them eats those Americans." She swallowed it. Because what was she supposed to say? She had just put on the uniform. She had fought to even get that uniform. And now the same uniform was being used to draw a border around her hands. Here's the part almost no one says out loud when they talk about the good war. In 1944, in an American Army installation, a black nurse could be ordered to comfort a captured German soldier in his native language, Schwester Schante Danke, while being told she was not permitted, not qualified, not appropriate to touch a white American's bandage. That is not a rumor. That is not a metaphor. That was procedure. On paper, Camp Florence existed to manage enemy prisoners. In practice, it became something else, a place where the U.S. Army could hide its own racial order inside a medical tent. That's the part that hit her. Because Elinor had not grown up naive. She knew segregation. She knew what America thought of black women in uniform. She knew she would have to work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. But she did not expect this, that her country would rather assign a black American nurse to protect the life of a sworn enemy than allow that same nurse to lay a hand on one of its white sons. And the desert made it worse. In the day, the inside of the ward felt like a slow oven. Canvas walls sweating, fans straining, the air so hot that alcohol evaporated almost as fast as you poured it on a cloth. At night, the heat dropped fast. You could hear boots on packed dirt. You could hear guards talking low in English. You could hear German voices, soft, careful, almost polite. Sometimes the politeness stung more than the insults. One POW, pale, barely 20, shaking with malaria, tried to sit up when she came near. He buttoned his shirt. He tried to say, "Ma'am." Ma'am. Elinor had never once, in training, been called ma'am by a white officer. That contrast, that quiet, that politeness from a man the U.S. Army called the enemy, that stayed in her throat. Because if the man in the cot could see her as a nurse, why couldn't her own country? By the end of her first week, she understood something that would haunt her long after the war ended. This was not just a hospital. It was proof. Proof that America could fight Hitler overseas and still keep pieces of his logic alive at home. And every time she tied off a bandage, every time she checked a fever, every time she walked past the invisible line that said, U.S. patients, authorized personnel only, she felt it tighten. This is where the anger starts. This is where the math begins. Morning started before there was light. 0450, wake, uniform on, hair pinned, cap straight. No one cared that the desert night had dropped to a chill that sat in the bones. No one cared that she'd slept 4 hours maybe. Your army, you move. She stepped out of her quarters and felt dust stick to her shoes instantly. Fine, bitter grit. Arizona grit. It lived in the seams of everything out here. The tents, the sheets, the lungs. By 5:30, she was already inside the POW ward. Head count, vitals, notes, row by row. Name? Fever? Any trouble breathing? Where does it hurt? The answers came back mostly in German. Sometimes in broken English, sometimes just in a look that said, "Please don't let me die in this place." Here is what's important. This was not a charity tent. This was the U.S. Army meeting its legal obligation. Under the Geneva Convention, America had to provide medical care to prisoners of war, so it did. But the way it did it, who it made do the work, who it refused to touch, who it pretended wasn't there, that was not written in any treaty. That was American. By 07 rations carts would roll through camp. German POWs received measured portions. Bread, stew, coffee substitute, sometimes fruit. It wasn't luxury, but it was structured, predictable. Elinor had watched that cart, quietly, day after day. It wasn't jealousy, it was calculation, because she knew what her own breakfast tray looked like, because she knew what her housing looked like, because she knew, and she would never forget this one detail. Some of those German prisoners were eating better than black Americans in uniform. Let that sit for a moment. They were wearing U.S. issue clothes now, prisoner fatigues. They were technically captured enemy personnel. They had been brought across an ocean in chains of paperwork and signatures, and still, the system found a way to make sure they were never considered beneath a white American. But her status was conditional. Her place in the hierarchy had to be enforced every hour so no one forgot. Powell, don't go past that curtain. Powell, stay with your side. Powell, you're assigned German ward. You're not cleared for Ward A. Ward A meant Americans. Ward A meant white. Ward A meant you don't belong here. No one wrote it that way on the chart. They didn't have to. By 0930, the heat had already turned the tent into a soft oven. Metal trays went warm just by sitting. Water jugs sweated and then emptied. Alcohol swabs dried out faster than you could peel them. Sweat stung her eyes. The white of her cap stayed white anyway. She would not let it look anything less than perfect. That was not vanity. That was survival. In a world determined to see her as sloppy, unfit, unclean, untrustworthy, presentation was armor. One German prisoner watched her change a bandage on his forearm. Slow, precise, gentle, professional. He said in careful English, almost rehearsed, "You are officer?" She nodded. "Yes, I am." He blinked. He looked confused. He had come from a system that said black. People were subhuman. And here he was, in an American camp, realizing that this black woman wore rank, realizing she had authority, realizing she was the one preventing infection in his body. You could see it in his eyes, the shock of it. But then his face shifted. From confusion to respect. He answered her softly. "Yes, Lieutenant." Lieutenant. The desert ward went quiet in her head when he said that word. Because that word, Lieutenant, was something she still did not reliably hear from her own side. When a white enlisted man in the U.S. Army spoke to her, Lieutenant sometimes turned into girl, or you people, or just silence, as if acknowledging her rank out loud would crack the world in half. This is where the math shows up. Segregation is not just insult, it is measurement. It is a chart that says value, a value B, value C, and then quietly, coldly places you below a captured enemy because of your color. You can hear men cough themselves raw in the cots. You can smell infection turning sweet and sour in gauze. You can feel fever through a blanket. And still, above all that, what screams the loudest is the math. Who gets food? Who gets clean sheets? Who gets to be called ma'am? Who gets to be called lieutenant? Who gets to touch the white wounded? Who does not? By noon, the ward always felt slower. Bodies sink into cots. Heat presses everyone down. Conversation dies. This is when the anger sharpened, because noon was when inspections happened. White officers walked through, clipboards in hand, arms behind the back, the stance of ownership. Sometimes they would nod at a German POW like he was a farm animal being evaluated for weight. Sometimes they would talk about the German's body out loud like the man wasn't in the bed. He'll live. He's strong. This one needs penicillin. This one's healing faster than projected. Then they would turn to Elinor and, instead of, "Good work, Lieutenant," she'd get, "Make sure they're stable. We don't want any incidents." Not, "Make sure he survives because every life matters under our care." Make sure there's no incident. Translation, it'll be a problem for us, politically, morally, optically, if a German POW dies in our hands. It will not be a problem for us if you leave here humiliated. Do you understand how surgical that is? They were not protecting the men in the cots out of love. They were protecting America's image. And Elinor was part of that image control, a black nurse in a neat uniform, serving a captured German with competence and restraint, the camera angle they liked. Look, world, we're civilized. We treat our prisoners well, but no camera stayed long enough to see the rest of the picture. That same black nurse being told, off camera, you're not to touch the white boys in Ward A. Afternoon bled into evening. 1600, 1700, 1830, desert sun dropping, canvas tents cooling. Down, the air finally loosening its grip. This is when the men talked. The German POWs, once the officers left, would let their shoulders drop. The faces changed. The tension in their necks faded. Sometimes they asked her questions. Where are you from? Do you have family? How long have you been nurse? Sometimes they tried to apologize, not for the war, but for something else they couldn't name. One of them, a former Luftwaffe mechanic with stitches along his jaw, said quietly, I was told, Americans are not kind to people like you. He didn't say black. He didn't have to. He looked scared too. She looked at him and said, plain, they're not. He swallowed. He looked away. That was the part that unsettled her the most. It wasn't that he pitied her. It was that even he, a captured foreign soldier, processed and numbered, could see the line that America drew around her. And he had only been here for weeks. She had lived on that line her whole life. By nightfall, after final rounds, after charts, after meds, after one more temperature check, after making sure the man in cot 12 hadn't slipped into crisis, Elinor would finally sit. Not in the main ward. She wasn't welcome to rest there. In a side space. A corner. By a metal desk with a low lamp that hummed, and she would write. Name, temp, respiration, medication, calm, clinical, perfect handwriting. Because here's the other math. Every number she wrote was proof she had done her job. If anyone tried to say she's negligent, if anyone tried to say she's not competent, if anyone tried to erase her, the numbers would still be there. Elinor understood very early that as a black woman in uniform, documentation was armor. You didn't get the luxury of trust. You built a paper wall. She stacked that paper every night. And somewhere between 2100 and 2300, the ward would go quiet. Just the buzz, the soft breathing, maybe a cough, bootsteps fading outside. And that's when the worst thought came in. Not anger, not even shame. It was the question, if I can keep him alive, femme po, why am I not allowed to touch my own? That question ate at her more than any insult. Because insults are loud. You can push back. The question is quiet. It just sits in your chest. And the more days passed in Camp Florence, the clearer the answer looked. It wasn't about skill. It wasn't about training. It wasn't about need. It was about order. America had drawn a racial map, and she was part of how it enforced that map. The German men in those cots, they were supposed to break. They were the defeated. But in one specific humiliating way, they outranked her. That is the kind of truth you don't forget. Not after the war. Not after the uniforms are folded away. Not even decades later when people start calling that time the Good War and tell the story like everyone in America was on the same side. They weren't. Not in that tent. Not in 1944. Not when the sun went down over the wire. And that is the night she realized. This wasn't just medicine. This was a map of who mattered, drawn in bandages and food and access and silence. This wasn't pity. It was arithmetic. Night fell hard in Arizona. No breeze, no sound, only the thin hum of the lamp over the ward desk. Elinor sat alone with the charts, names, temperatures, numbers, all in order. Outside somewhere, a coyote called once and then stopped. The desert never needed an audience. It was close to 11 p.m. when the canvas door flap moved. A shadow, then the voice. Lieutenant Powell. She didn't look up right away. Sir? Captain Reynolds, White Medical Corps, walked in with his cap still on. He didn't remove it. He stood there like the air belonged to him. I've been reviewing ward assignments, he said. Command thinks you've been overstepping. She set her pen down slowly. Overstepping, sir? He looked around, scanning the empty cots as if the prisoners might overhear. You've been seen assisting in Ward A. That's not your section. Ward A again. The invisible border. Her hands stayed folded. Yes, sir. I was asked to help with a burn case. There was no one else available. He frowned. That's not the point. You know the procedure. Yes, sir, she said quietly. I know the procedure. He stepped closer. You people should be grateful you're even serving. Don't make it difficult. There it was. The sentence that carried a century of rot, delivered casually, like small talk. She kept her voice steady. Permission to speak freely, sir? He hesitated. Go ahead. She turned one of the charts toward him. Half the names on it ended in Mann, Schmidt, Bauer. Half the men in this ward are German prisoners of war, she said. Her voice didn't shake. None of them are American, none of them are black, but I'm the one keeping them alive. He didn't like her tone. He didn't like her facts. That's the assignment, he said flatly. Orders come from above. Above, she repeated softly. Then she looked at him directly. Do you realize what that means, Captain? He shifted his weight. She didn't stop. It means my country trusts me with the lives of the men it calls enemies, but not with its own. It means I can touch a Nazi's wound, but not an American's bandage. He opened his mouth, then closed it. This is not about trust, he said finally. It's about... She cut him off. Policy. Silence. He nodded once, relieved she'd said it for him. Yes, policy. She stood then, not defiant, just tired. If policy is all that matters, then maybe you should rename this place. He frowned. What? She looked around the tent, the rows of sleeping men, the white sheets, the barred windows. Call it what it is, she said. The Nazi hospital. Her words landed like a drop of ice. The fan clicked once. The bulb buzzed. The captain's face tightened. You're out of line, he said. She smiled, barely. No, sir, she whispered. I'm right on it. He turned sharply and left. The flap closed. The sound disappeared into the desert. And that was the night she stopped trying to be invisible. She sat back down. The pen trembled in her hand. For the first time, not from exhaustion. She wrote anyway. Name, date, pulse, notes, perfect letters, perfect order, perfect armor. Because if she faltered, if her record had one flaw, someone would use it as proof that she didn't belong here, proof that the line was justified. So she wrote until her eyes blurred. At midnight, she looked up at the last cot in the row, a German sergeant, young bandaged arm across his chest. He was awake, staring at the ceiling. He said something soft in German. She caught one word, Mensch, human. She didn't answer, but she knew what it meant, and for the first time she realized how twisted this all was. That the first man to look at her without calculation, without command, without fear, was a prisoner of war. She leaned back in the chair. I treated their enemies like men, she whispered. My country treated me like one of them. The lamp hummed louder. Then it flickered. Then it steadied. She looked at her gloved hands, still clean, still white under the yellow light, and thought about what they had touched that day. Skin, fever, blood pressure cuff, paper, all the same temperature, the same humanity. But out there in the camp, in the chain of command, in the neat columns of rules and ranks, humanity had a color. And she wasn't it. That night, she knew. This wasn't just medicine. This was history, written in gloves and silence. The desert didn't care. The stars didn't care. But she did. And she would carry that silence for the rest of her life. The war ended. The news didn't arrive in one dramatic trumpet blast. It arrived in fragments. Rumor first, then official word, then transport orders. Germany surrendered. Prisoners would be processed. Some would be shipped back. Some would be held longer. Camp Florence began to loosen. The wire stayed up, but tension dropped. The guards weren't as sharp. The inspections weren't as theatrical. Men smiled more. Men talked more. Men, even the ones who had once held their shoulders high and silent like they were still on parade, started to look like what they really were. Young, tired, alive for now. And what about her? That is the part almost nobody tells. Because the way these stories are usually told, the camera cuts right here. The war ended, America was victorious, everyone hugged, roll credits. That's not what happened. When the uniforms came off, the rules did not. The segregation did not. The way the Army saw her did not. Elinor Powell did not step out of that desert hospital and get treated like an American hero. She stepped out and discovered that outside the barbed wire, the country still had another barbed wire waiting. Here is one of the quiet truths of Camp Florence. Healing is contact. When you take pulses, when you cool a forehead, when you steady a shaking hand so a needle can go in, you're not just doing a task, you're telling a body, stay here, stay alive. And that does something two ways. She knew their faces, they knew hers. Over months of pain and fever and boredom and fear, something formed between her and at least one of those prisoners that war propaganda never accounted for: trust. One of them was a young German soldier named Frederick Albert. Not an officer, not a famous name in any book, just one more human being handed to the machine and stamped enemy. He had been transported, processed, numbered, stripped down to status. But in the ward, he was a patient, and to her, a patient meant a life you did not throw away. They spoke, at first in simple words, then in longer ones. He was surprised by her calm. She was, at first, almost offended by his politeness, because here was the impossible picture: a black American nurse and a captured German soldier sitting in a U.S. Army POW camp in Arizona, talking like two people, not like categories. That alone in 1944 was a quiet revolution, and it did not disappear when the war did. After Germany surrendered, men like Frederick Albert weren't instantly free. Processing them back into civilian life took time. They worked farm details, they did labor, they waited. But when he finally left the wire, he didn't just vanish into Europe, he found his way back to her. They married. That sentence is simple. It is not small. A black American woman in the 1940s marrying a former German POW was not a hallmark ending. It was an act of defiance against two countries at once. To white America, she had always been not equal. To much of white America in 1945, a German, even a former low-ranking soldier, was still the enemy. Now imagine both labels in one household, in one marriage, in one photograph. They paid for that. Landlords refused to rent to them. Neighbors accidentally made sure they understood they were watched. Police attention lingered too long. Even within hospitals, the very world where she had already proven herself, she felt the doors stay half shut. Positions already filled. We're not currently hiring in that unit. We'll keep your information on file. Sometimes the smile delivered the rejection. Sometimes the silence did. Here is the cruelty. She had medical experience under pressure. She had run shifts in an under-resourced ward in lethal heat. She had kept prisoners alive because it was the law, not because anyone made it easy. That should have made her valuable anywhere. Instead, it made her suspect. To some people, she wasn't a nurse who had served America. She was the black nurse who married one of them. The mark of one of them didn't come off. There's no medal for that. There's no parade. There's not even a line in most history books. Most people in America never heard her name. Think about that. The country will happily tell you how nobly it treated German POWs, how fairly, how humanely. It will point to photographs, POWs working on farms, POWs eating in a mess hall, POWs receiving treatment, POWs healed under the Red Cross. Look how civilized we were. It almost never says who changed the dressings, who took the temperatures, who turned the men on their sides at 3 a.m. so fluid wouldn't drown them. It almost never says a black nurse did that because we wouldn't let her do it for us. And in the years after the war, when America moved into its next version of itself, suburbs, victory posters, GI Bill, new cars, the good old days, women like Elinor were expected to disappear into the wallpaper. Smile, be quiet, don't bring up the desert, don't bring up how you learned that the word enemy is flexible and the word equal is not. She and Frederick built a life anyway. They had a son. They raised him in a world that didn't know what box to put him in. Think of that child for a moment. He grew up hearing that Nazis were evil. He grew up hearing that black Americans were less. He grew up knowing his mother had saved men who wore swastikas, and his country still wouldn't say her name. That child had to answer a question almost no one else in his generation ever had to answer. What does American even mean if my mother was good enough to save a German, but not good enough to be called equal? Decades later, long after VE Day and VJ Day had turned into anniversaries and speeches, someone finally bothered to ask about her. Her story began to surface in museums, in interviews, in articles. Words like first, pioneer, courage started to appear around her name. It was late. It was quiet. It was not national. But it was something. And here is the line you need to carry. She did not become important because she married a German prisoner. She became important because her life exposes the lie. America told the world, we are the moral side. Her story forces a second question, moral for who? Because Elinor Powell served her country, and then for decades, her country pretended not to remember. That silence is part of the cost. Not every wound is on the body. Some wounds are in the record, and the record leaves you out on purpose. Listen, people love to say World War II was simple. Good versus evil, democracy versus dictatorship, America versus fascism. It sounds clean, it sells clean, it feels good to repeat. But walk back into that tent in Arizona, look at what was actually happening. A black American nurse in a U.S. Army uniform was allowed, ordered, to keep a captured German soldier alive. She checked his pulse, cooled his fever, wrote his chart. She called him sir sometimes, because respect is part of care. Now, look at what she was not allowed to do. She was not allowed to put that same hand, the same trained, steady, qualified hand, on the arm of a white American private in Ward A. Ask yourself, what is that? Policy, security, protocol, or something uglier that no one wanted to say on paper? They told her it was about assignments. They told her it was about order. They told her it was about keeping things smooth. Call it what it is. They were saying, you can serve. You can sweat, you can carry, you can save the life of a man who wore the enemy's patch, but you will not stand equal next to us. And then when the war was over, they expected her to vanish. They erased her from the story and kept the part that made America look kind. See? We treated POWs with dignity. Yes, because a black woman made sure of it. The United States called that humanitarian. But when she asked to be treated with that same humanity, the answer was, not you. That's the fracture. That's the thing this country still doesn't like to look at directly, because it forces a question that feels like a knife. If you say you were fighting fascism overseas, while running skin color hierarchies in your own hospitals, what were you really fighting for? Freedom, or image, honor, or control? She sat in that ward, under a buzzing lamp, with desert night pressing against the canvas, and understood something most war stories never admit. A uniform doesn't guarantee respect. A flag doesn't guarantee protection. A victory banner doesn't erase a wound that was never allowed to heal. She never asked what color a wound was. America did. They called it policy. You tell me what it really was. History remembers the war. It remembers the prisoners. It remembers the surrender papers signed in bright daylight. Almost nobody remembers the quiet black nurse in Arizona who kept the enemy breathing, and then had to come home and prove she was human. Silence. That's the part they hoped you'd never hear.